Thank you for having me here. What an important way to celebrate the end of the school year, but also to have you here, not because it's about my presentation, but really a way that I think about the world. Not only that's reflected in the title here, right? Essential workers as academic workers. And what does this all mean? And how are we related? In the sense that the guiding principle that brings me to the work that I do every day, but also how I've made sense of the world through my personal but professional and research trajectories, right? So this whole guiding principle of being, and within my study of history, and in particular my area, the history of education, really centers on this German philosopher's notion. Now, based on his book, Truth and Method, which actually I'm going to admit I did not read all 700 pages of it, but what really stood out to me was this notion that we are already related. Now, if we are to really truly take this seriously, it's really profound, right? It's profound in the ways that, oh my goodness, what does that mean for me? What is my responsibility to somebody else? What is society's responsibility to each other? If we start from this default notion that we are already related, right? And I would say the good, bad, and the ugly, because it encompasses all those things when we talk about our biological relations or our adopted family relations. It's complicated. So it all comes and brings together the complexity with how I hope to capture what just a glimpse of the way that I've approached the work at the University of Illinois. So to start with that, right, kind of a sense of who and where I am. I think about this often, where I do have time to reflect a bit about, wow, here I am at the University of Illinois, an incredible flagship institution, and seeing how I started off as an immigrant child in 1974 from Tacoma, Washington to here. And I'll talk about that briefly, but also how I became somebody within the university, like a department head or a faculty person, for example. I learned a lot through kind of what I term, and it's not to belittle the key essential work that you all do at the university, but how I came to that as an undergraduate student at the University of Washington in Seattle. So I got all of my degrees from UW, as we say, and I learned early on, my first semester as a first year student, I am first generation, meaning I'm of the first in my family, along with my brother, to be able to enter an institution of higher education. And there's, of course, many reasons for that, which I'll also be referring to. But because my family didn't have a lot in terms of financial resources, I was fortunate to be able to be the recipient of a number of financial aid, Pell grants, other types of grants that were available in the late 1980s, but also the work study experience. I really credit my early work study experiences as an undergraduate to help me understand the nature of academic work and faculty relations. Now that I'm a faculty person, it really helped me out because I was coming in as an observer, but also somebody who did the work that many others, right, typically as work study students do, whether it's going on errands from campus building to the other, whether it's making photocopies of textbooks so that professors can have access to provide more copies to their students. It taught me a lot about staff relations, faculty and staff relations, but also the building workers that really house all of this important academic work that comes together. And so it gave me an insider's perspective on the nature of campus work and the infrastructure, literally the infrastructure of how that works. It also, on the other hand, made me understand what it meant to be racialized and sexualized as a 19-year-old in forms of harassment in one of my first work study positions, taking inventory for the School of Music. And I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know how to make sense of it because it's not as if this was part of my daily experience. I didn't know if there was a reporting system, if I knew how to report that. But that also provided me, as a young person fresh out of high school, experiences of what it meant to be a part of work and the workplace, and helping me to understand my role and the responsibilities that I need to do. I won't go into a lot more details about the various types of work study experiences that I've had, but in the ways that I've had, it taught me, obviously, about administration, about staff relations, about again, gender relations, about racism, the way that it works and doesn't work on college campuses. Again, the good, bad, and the ugly components of it. But it really comprises these important lessons that I carry with me today. And a lot of it at that time, as a young person, it was obviously formed by not knowing who I was or where I was. What does this campus mean? What does this the place of the higher education institution? What does that mean in the whole scheme of things? So what I treasured so much in my undergraduate years was not only this work experience that I had, but the learning environment where I was exposed to so many wonderful learning opportunities with dynamic professors, and just really the courses and the readings where that process of unlearning and the time in which I wanted to shed everything of who I am towards an ideal that wasn't really viable nor healthy. So I always am grateful for these moments in how I came to be. And so part of that, right, is formed by geopolitics and how and where did I become who I am, but it's also how did someone like me, so this is me on the right-hand side, I'm standing in front of, and I want to say this is the end of my kindergarten year, because I can tell I'm getting a little chubby there from my favorite potato chips. And so it's still kind of my Achilles heel, but yet so proud. And my dad took this picture of me in front of my elementary school, Cherrydale School in Steilacoom Historical School District, or the first school district in the state of Washington, even though I lived within the Tacoma city limits. And so here he is so proud of me finishing kindergarten, or in the middle of kindergarten, but what it meant and how that journey as that 5-year-old now on the University of Illinois campus. And there's a story that my mom loves to tell to this day, where my first day of school in the Steilacoom schools was as a first grader, and I really should have been placed in kindergarten, and they soon found out that mistake. But my first day in first grade, where I knew nothing about schools or the US school system, really ended up in a form of, at that time, I was horrified. I was horrified because I'm sitting here, the desks are in neat little rows, the bell rings, and it seemed like the school had just started, but the bell rings, and it was for the first recess bell. And I had no idea what was happening because the other kids seemed to know what they were doing. They went, grabbed their coats, went outside. And I'm sitting there on my own thinking, what in the world is happening? And so what is the only logical response of a new kid in a new country, can't speak the language, sitting there by themselves? Of course, I'm bawling my eyes out. and and the poor teacher and the fellow other classmates, they're trying desperately to help me out, but we can't communicate. But the only thing that I knew is that I hated school. I never wanted to go back ever, because it was such a traumatic experience. And so my mom talks about that, is how did a little girl crying her way in the first day of school become a university professor at the University of Illinois? So those, and the ways that it makes me think about the hows and the whys, become so interesting in that light. But also it's about the geopolitical ways in which how I ended up at a great institution, which, all right, can I get to the next slide here? Okay. And part of that is I was really fortunate as well to have grown up with stories about my family's history, but in particular centered around the war. And when we talk about the war in my family, it's the Korean War. And I say identities formed by her stories because it was through my grandmother and through my mother. So it was through those. And my dad, he grew up in the southern part of South Korea, near Busan. So he didn't experience what my mom's side of the story, family experienced, but his with his own interesting and important history as well. But really around my maternal side of the family, with having grown up, who knows for how many generations in what is now considered North Korea. And so her stories and my grandmother's stories really being influenced through their stories about living under Japanese rule. So my mom was born in 1936. And so it was in the middle of Japanese colonialism and their process of what other historians have called in other contexts, especially for indigenous tribes, deculturalization. So doing everything possible that who you are as a Korean is stripped away. So she was forced to take on a Japanese name. The Korean language could not have been spoken in public, nor ideally from the Japanese perspective at that time, in your own home. So there were a lot of things that had to be done in secret to really then continue and impart a sense of who you are and identity. Of course, with that, what happens during their escape as a family on foot from North Korea to the South Korean border during the Korean War, and what happens in this process becomes an important part, a central part actually, because I'm reminded of this so often to the present day. So it's really interesting. And maybe people are calling it now intergenerational trauma, and maybe there's another term where that memory, that intergenerational memory, continues. So that I find that on another level very fascinating, and how I feel so directly connected to it. And in many ways, it's because I am through their stories. And so these images, the first one on the top is supposed to capture kind of that life under Japanese rule, and then the bottom is in places outside of Korea, for example, that becomes a fight for Korean independence. And of course, what I'm sharing with you is just such, not even a surface level historical overview, but really the place in which I come to be in Illinois with my family as well. But the thing that I've learned recently, watching a documentary happenstance on the Korean War, was how much the establishment of the 35th parallel was so arbitrary, right? It was just a line across the map. But yet, what does that line across the map mean? Because yeah, on the one hand, it's arbitrary, but on the other hand, it's real. It is so real, right? And we know to this day too, it's not just an isolated incident, but how these things occur. And so these are images from the internet, but also reflective of the kinds of stories that my family would tell about the realities of war and the forced displacement, where your family have lived for generations and generations before you even knew that there was a sense of reality, but yet how that's gone in one fell swoop. And the victims, the youngest victims of this, and my family stories of the youngest victims of war, unfortunately, not isolated, but all too common, and how these images reflect those everyday struggles, and also the everyday juxtaposition, if you will. So on the bottom left, you have the soldiers going in to battle, and you have families escaping the very path and the ways in which everything that you have, your possessions, right, that you carry, and who you carry is also the next generation on your backs. And my mom, as an adolescent during this time, really talking about having to take care of the toddlers who were part of their family and even young babies. And the places in which a yearning for home, right? And that was really strong for her. And it makes me, and it makes sense as to why she never really wanted to do a lot of traveling, but wanting to stay home and having that sense of security and safety within it. Of course, except for when I got this job and she said, well, maybe it's time you kind of leave home too, right? But again, just to show you on the map, I mean, just the divided line of the 35th, I'm sorry, the 38th parallel. And Pyongyang would have been around the place where my mom and her family for generations have lived, and traveling with so many others by foot to the border. And what she could was freedom for her and her family, but there were family members who were left. And to this day, there are members of my grandmother's side who are there. So it's also, as we settled and immigrated to the United States, and it's also, how do we make a life? How do we make a living? And the kinds of daily struggles that my parents had to face, because they had a high school education. They did not have a college education in their native country. Their English was very limited in terms of fluency. There were structural limits in terms of the kinds of employment that they could have. And so we didn't have necessarily mutual aid societies. We had family help. My aunt in particular, who we consider the matriarch of the family, my mom's older sister, and who through her sponsorship of my family, we were able to immigrate. And she married an American soldier in Korea. And so their story too is an important one, that my uncle, by marriage, he grows up in a rural part of Tennessee, outside of Murfreesboro, Tennessee. And so how does he, a country boy, right, end up as a soldier in Korea, marrying my aunt and settling in a place where they're now able to help and sponsor not only myself, but fellow members of their church over time. And those are also powerful stories of community and forms of resistance to a degree. But with these immigration settlements and stories, it's not, the kinds of rosy immigrant success stories that we may hear, but what it means when you're having to think about the day-to-day financial struggles. And so the top photo is a photo of a place that actually my sister and brother and my mom and my dad, who's now deceased, would have liked to forget. This is now called King's Deli and Grocery, but when my mom and dad bought the store from, I think his name was Fred McCabe, it was McCabe's Grocery, we kept that. And there's, to this day, I could give you probably kind of even the whole sensory experience of what it meant to work in that store. There was a constant stench inside that building, and there was constant unhappiness. There was a spirit of that was there. And so what I would consider the nadir of my family's history for 10 years, that was our existence. But the silver lining was that because my mom and dad had that store, and because we had such little money coming in from there, that was how I was able to have the kind of financial aid and grants that I did to be able to go to the University of Washington. So on the one hand, it's a place of vilification on so many levels, but on the other hand, I have to acknowledge that it was a huge part of our family's history and settlement. But it's also emblematic of so many others who came to the US. And now we're trying to understand, what does it mean to be in a place, in a multiracial, multicultural, multilingual society, where on the bottom are photographs taken after the Los Angeles riots of 1982. Or is it 1992? I'm sorry, not 82, but 92, because I was in almost entering graduate school, or the beginning of graduate school, and seeing that unfold at the time that my mom and dad owned this store, and working there and seeing these images on television and realizing it's so deeply embedded in how we have not understood each other's stories, because it's about, right, not only the immigration stories of work, but structural racism throughout our society, and the ways in which that communities and communities of color have been displaced over time, how we've not understood fully our stories. And even from my own family and my own community's perspectives, we didn't understand ourselves. And so it also ties with that process of unlearning and understanding through our stories. And it was around this time that I really then had to question this notion of how and where do I belong, given the ways that I was raised. And it was embedded in ways that would not invite a sense of opening and understanding as well. But it's also a way in which the one story that I tell, right, these immigration stories, and it's always a plurality, and it's always important to understand how much of this is a plurality and a diversity of stories, because it's also revealing, just this graph here, here's a range, just a small range, because scholars would note that there's about 40 different groups within what we consider the Asian American Pacific Islander category, right? So when we look at those among the Asian American Pacific Islander populations, the percent below poverty, and there's quite a range, right? So it reveals the range of what does it mean to be in these groups, and know that there are such a disproportionate amount still living in poverty. And how do we also come to understand their stories of settlement and displacement as part of our United States story as well? But yet, what continues to persist is this monolithic story, right? It continues to prevail. I think somebody's mic is on. I'm going to wait for, if you could please mute the mic, that'd be, oh shoot, that'd be greatly appreciated. So what happens within this is that a monolithic story continues to prevail. It's this notion that we are somehow this great mono minority, and we really need to begin to, not begin, but continue to turn this on its head, to say, you know, there's actually a particular historical reasoning for that. And it's not an accident that this monolithic story of success of the mono minority, as we call it, it occurs during the 1960s in the middle of the civil rights movement. It was a way in which to denigrate other minority groups, in particular African Americans, in the fight for civil rights, so that civil rights laws are not passed, and to also question the meaning of civil rights legislation when they highlight, in particular, Japanese and Chinese Americans as having made it, right? That they have pulled themselves up by their own bootstraps in order to be successful, and that no government handouts were necessary. And these texts from primary sources from that time definitely highlight that. And again, this is how this form of a monolithic stereotypical story has prevailed. And I was not, obviously, around when these stories were taking place, but yet how did it then become implanted not only in my head, but within my own high school teachers at this time? When this comes out, the Time magazine, those Asian American whiz kids, right? So this again still prevails that, oh yeah, you Asians are so great, so smart in everything you do, right? So highly successful. Now, when you read the articles within the Time magazine here back in the late 1980s, there are some of those important stories of war, of immigration status, but the whole underlying message is not that different from what prevailed in the mid 1960s. And that the other underlying lesson to be learned, allegedly, was that, well, Asians did it, so why can't all the other groups? Well, it's not true. And so it comes to play that within my own life, because I've somehow internalized this notion that, I always give an example in my classes that I cheated my way through math in high school, that I would cheat through advanced placement calculus. And really, that the teachers would never know that this was so obvious, that I was so not even algebra worthy, but yet they wanted to believe this story. And I wanted to believe this story. And yet there's something about this story that just doesn't jive, because it's been held as the monolithic story to know and to understand, when that's obviously not the case. Again, very very simplistic notion of what there is in the world of scholarship on this topic, but really to lend that idea of how these things become played out in our lives. But the other thing too is there's dangers in that, right? Because it then creates these notions that not only should there be this one story, but yet all Asians are not only the same, they also look the same. And that was one of the elements of earlier historical examples of anti-Asian hate and violence and murder. And the story of Who Killed Vincent Chin being an important feature of that in 1982, and the way in which in different parts of the United States, the solidification of Asian American studies becomes an outgrowth of it. And I'm sorry for that typo on the screen. The S should be up above with the problematics therein. But Vincent Chin, being an engineer at GM, and the night before his wedding, he's murdered by two other GM workers, because this is also the time period in which there's the gas crisis. The Japanese automobile industry is, people are buying Hondas, and it was probably Datsuns and not Toyotas at the time, because they wanted more fuel efficient cars. And so blaming Japan, and not necessarily kind of what's happening with the gas crisis, they take it out on Vincent Chin and saying it's because of you, MF, that we are out of a job, right? And not knowing that Vincent Chin was also working for GM at the time. So he's brutally murdered because the GM workers thought that he was Japanese, right? Because there's this, again, notion that we all look the same, and it was his fault that these workers at GM were out of a job. There's great, if you want to do further video Googles, I mean, it's definitely available, but something that came out there that is an important recent history of the ways in which these monolithic stories that are told become harmful relics and violent relics of anti-Asian hate that continues. But it's also in the ways that we have to understand, right, that we are connected through these stories. These are not pleasant stories to hear, but it's something that we have to always question ourselves, right? How was it that, and I'll come back to kind of around the title of and the reasoning and why I chose the title that I did, because it's through these stories that we are maybe filled with half truths and incomplete stories that we still have yet to continue to learn to listen through different types of stories, that where it brings the full humanity of us together. Actually, I'm going to kind of be done fairly soon, I think. Well, here's why. And here's why I come back to this notion. And let me, oh, so I do have my chat open. All right, so I'll give an extra credit to someone who can, all right, so can anyone chat? Do you recognize the background here? You can take a guess. Maybe you're still munching your lunches. Oh, well, that's a good guess. All right, well, oh, yeah, that's a very good guess. Actually, that's Vancouver, Washington, not Van, oh my gosh, that's not Vancouver, Washington. I know Vancouver, Washington. That's Vancouver, British Columbia. So this is at Queen Elizabeth Park in Vancouver. And we're actually my family. So you'll see my cursor. There's my dad there. That's not correct. I always have fun with this in class as well. All right, so I'll do this slowly. So there's my dad there. There's me. So this is probably in the middle of, I want to say, second grade or end of first grade, given the way that I look. There's my sister, who's the oldest, my brother. That's my cousin who lived in Vancouver at the time. So that's my cousin and my mom, obviously. And why do I come to this point? Well, there's a couple of reasons, because it's also about memory. So my memory of this moment and this photograph, I was convinced that we were taking this photograph in Seattle. But of course, it was only like a few years ago, my memory obviously having failed me, and looking at the photo, still wanting to believe it's Seattle, but I had to have, and I didn't want to really see it until I think my spouse was like, there's no way in in the world that that's Seattle. Like, how did you not see that? So that also comes to my mind's eye about, this is what I wanted to believe so much, that this was Seattle. I didn't see that it's not. And it also comes to the stories that we want to believe so deeply. Well, that's not reality, right? But we are so somehow ingrained and feeling attached to a certain discourse or certain type of story that we don't fully understand. So that also comes to this notion that we need to develop fuller stories, that lens for a realistic perspective and view based on this physical evidence, where I had sworn it wasn't actually where it was. But also, how and in what ways does it tie to this form of essential work and academic work? Well, because part of the other immigrant story from my family, from my cousin's family and my aunt and uncle, whose work also would be considered essential work in Vancouver, but also the kind of work that my mom and dad were only able to do. But they did it proudly, and they did it because they knew it was providing for the family. They knew that it was work that was a means to get somewhere. And they were never so happy as when, after they stopped work, and thankfully we were finally able to sell that store that now became King's Grocery, that there was a sense of relief, a sense of freedom that they had. And the work that they were able to get and this was a kind of work that they would have been able to choose, was as maintenance workers at an Episcopal church in Lakewood, Washington. They loved that work as janitors, as knowing that they could be there to make sure that the little kids who were attending Sunday school and preschool during the week would have clean carpets, clean kitchens and bathrooms. They loved it. They loved it so much. They loved being able to be a part of a congregation, even though they didn't know, the congregation didn't know who my mom and dad were because they were coming in after hours. But the people who were there were welcoming of their work and appreciative of their work. But their essential work also formed a part of my academic work, because if it wasn't for their essential work over the years, I wouldn't have become who I am. And so that's why I say essential workers, not only like my mom and dad, but so many other folks, right? They're doing and contributing to academic work, whether it's directly or indirectly, right? Taking classes or with their kids or siblings or anyone else, their partners, being a part of this university that allows it to function in the ways that they do. And truth be told, because of that upbringing that I have, I do feel much more comfort being around staff and being around other maintenance workers than sometimes my own peers in academia. Don't tell them that, but that's just kind of my comfort level, because there's, to me, a sense of a realness to it, even though it may be a kind of realness that I do not agree with, but it's who they are. And how do we also continue to form these connections about essential and academic work? Because we know when we don't have that essential work done as academics, we know that we can't do our work as well. So the part of kind of my perspective doing this talk, and thank you again for allowing me to do this talk, is that to speak in different ways about what it means to be Asian American for me, but through the story that I tell about my family as a way that it's encapsulated within geopolitics, the ways in which it becomes a story through movement from the West Coast of the United States to the Midwest here, and how through my presence, through so many other people who are like me, it makes an impact in ways that we can share each other's stories and come to understand. So that's what I have to share for today. And I'm not still sharing, correct? I am not still sharing. All right. So thank you again for this time. Look at that. I pretty much stopped on the time that I said I would.
Well, we really appreciate you, Yoon, speaking to us. I think that was a very interesting talk. I got to say that I found the idea that your teachers were making assumptions about you in the positive was a very interesting take on things, not assuming that you would be cheating, but that you were just a whiz kid. I find that very interesting. Let's open it up for questions. If anyone else has anything they would like to ask Yoon while she's here, feel free. You can even put it in the chat. If you don't want to talk, I can read whatever's in the chat.
Sure.
Everybody's still at lunch, I guess, still
That's
talking
fine.
through.
So and you know, the other thing that I would say is that what I've noticed more as a faculty on campus with other Asian American kids who may seem, right, who may seem high achieving, there's a lot of underlying mental challenges that they face because they feel like they have to live up to this. So it's another way that we have to understand how we are related in this way, connected, that, you know, it's okay not to have to feel like you do that, because then it creates different levels of tensions with other students and student groups. So if I can add that, I would appreciate your listening on that front, and to also how we can help each other in every way. So if we're going to be an inclusive campus, we also have to understand how do we listen inclusively. So thank you again. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your 15 minutes.
Thank you. We really appreciate it. Open it up one more time. Does anyone have any other questions they'd like to ask? I was interested in, did you say that you still have relatives in North Korea?
I do. They're on my grandmother's side, and I don't know who they are. And I tried asking my mom, and she couldn't, they didn't know people's name, or, their own family's names. They just kind of know by relation. So it could be maybe siblings of my grandma, but then, they would not probably be alive at this point.
And I just to circle back on that, the reason why your grandmother and your mother went to South Korea, did you touch on what that reason was? I know that
Because
the Japanese were trying to erase the culture, but
it was the Korean War, and if they stayed in North Korea, there's no way that they would have had the freedom. So it was North Koreans fleeing what would be their future, which is what is now under communism, and most certain a life of incredible hardship. So yeah, they were fleeing for their freedom.
as so many do,
Yes.
it's always nice to hear these stories of people
Yes.
getting out and having a better life where they end up at. Well, thank you again, Dr. Pak, for speaking with us. It was very enjoyable talk. Like I said before, we've got this recorded and we will be posting it so that anyone who was not able to get on during this time will still be able to partake in your presentation.
Sure, great, thank you, and
Yeah.
thank you for having me.